Welcome back as we continue to talk about Central Christian Church turning points. We are starting a new conversation about the church's turn to be an anti-racist institution. And we have been on a journey as a whole to kind of investigate and see how the institution of the church participates in racism. So today we have Matthias Beier with us, and we're just going to have a conversation about institutional racism as a whole, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. Matthias, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Louis, for having me here.
I think it's always important for the church to be reminded whenever we have conversations about racism in the setting of the church that we're not necessarily talking about interpersonal violence, but we're talking about the system itself, the systemic system that is created that perpetuates racism and the harm that it causes. And while it's easy to say that words and actions are hurtful, which they are, systemic structures, practices can cause just as much harm. So in a sense, based on your understanding and the conversations that we've had before, talk a little bit about how racism not only is perpetuated by ideas about God, but how the church perpetuates those ideologies.
Yeah. So, racism, from my perspective and analysis, is really an attempt to play God. And the reason why institutional racism is so powerful is partly because the institution is always bigger than an individual. And so there is a group psychology behind it, partly. So institutions like laws, for instance, they are seen as absolute, and they're actually being confused with God. So racism is a form of playing God, whether it's somebody holding racist views explicitly, personally, or whether it is there in a system. Racism is an expression of violent God images, personally, group-wise, systemically. And from my perspective, it's very important to understand why institutions function this way and why theology, why faith gets used in this way.
Can you talk a little bit about the whys?
Really, our human nature, our human self-awareness. One of the things that characterizes us as human beings in a unique way is we are able to think about that we're finite. Now, many other species experience finitude, hunger, their droughts and whatever, but we reflect on this. We have a prefrontal cortex that takes this and makes certain meanings out of it. And so what we can learn from not just philosophy, but also from psychology, especially existential psychology, but also there is a theory called terror management theory. It was developed out of Ernest Becker's work. Ernest Becker wrote this very well-known book, The Denial of Death, and said that really, whether we think about it consciously or not, we are always in some way responding to our own death. What we are experiencing when we consciously think about our death, and we very often experience this most when we have lost someone, someone who is really dear to us, then we feel this much more visceral often than us just sitting there and reflecting on our death. It's not abstract, it's very real, right? When we have lost love. There's actually an idea that in evolutionary research and what we call ethology, the study of comparative behavior between humans and animals, and anthropological research, is that the idea of God probably originated, for one reason, because of our awareness of losing a loved one. There are many other reasons, cannibalism, war, what have you, right? But this is a very important one. And so we started believing in a higher power, in a God, which was very early symbolized with birds, with red ochre, indicating that the person who died didn't really fully die, but they're still alive. So the reason why I'm talking about this is the emergence of faith in a God went hand in hand with our awareness of our death and with our fear of death as well. And so faith in God in many respects functions as, at its best, that we have hope that the love we experience, the connection we experienced, will not really fully come to an end, that the precious person we were with will continue to exist, right? That's sort of the trajectory here. Now, what happens in racism, from my perspective, is that we are experiencing the fear of not mattering. And I think you may be seeing where this is going.
Yeah.
So a very powerful slogan that has characterized the recent fight against racism is Black Lives Matter, right? And that is touching really on the root cause of racism. The root cause of racism from a theological, spiritual perspective is that there is a fear of not mattering by a group, by really first persons, but then again the group is used as kind of a shield, and as, okay, we are the ones who really matter.
Which then becomes the cry for all lives matter, blue lives matter.
Exactly. Now, this is really important, though, to understand that behind racism is first a fear of not mattering. There's a fear of not mattering. There is annihilation anxiety. So what we hear, for instance, the shooter of the 10 people in the supermarket in Buffalo had been affected by the Great Replacement theory, right? Yeah. That kind of rhetoric that's been going around, or this has affected politics quite a bit. This dominates immigration policies.
Yeah.
Because there is the fear of, if we say that all people matter, then we matter less. Behind this Great Replacement theory is a fear of that we will be replaced. We will not matter anymore. We will be insignificant. We will be irrelevant. We will be nothing. The great fear of nothingness. This is what existential therapy talks about, or existential philosophy talks about, and terror management theory is a social psychology theory that has studied that when people are unconsciously exposed to stimuli that awaken their mortality awareness, unconsciously even. Like you can show people slides, you have the word coffee in it, in the other one you have the word coffin in it. The one with the people who see coffin will be more prejudiced. So there is an unconscious fear of, they call that mortality salience. And so that's, from my perspective, really at the root of it. Now, this fear, though, has to get out of hand first.
Yeah.
And so this is where I want to connect with a Bible story that is very important. The so-called fall story.
Oh, we consider Adam
and Eve, right, and the taking of the fruit, and so on. But in that story, this story is actually a story that can teach us something about what happens in racism. And it connects also to the text that in Luke 14. In Luke 14, there is one of the ideas there is that we should basically give everything, right? Let everything go. That can be very misunderstood if we understand it in a certain way. Yeah. It can increase fear of not mattering. That's not what that passage means. So let me go to Genesis 3. Something happens that distorts the image of God. And in order to understand what distorts the image of God, we have to first go to Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, God, creates Adam and Eve, and then walks around with them in the garden, right? Has a nice stroll in the garden, right?
Says it's good.
Says everything's good. Says you can eat from all the trees in the garden, just from that one tree in the middle of the garden, don't eat. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat from it,
you die.
You shall die, right? And so they don't have a problem with it. Yeah. They actually have no problem with it. Yeah. And then at the end of that chapter in Genesis 2:25, it says that they were naked. Yes. They were not ashamed of it. And I describe a lot of this in this book here, A Violent God Image, my book, where I've described some of this, and I'm applying this book, the analysis in this book, to the problem of racism. So then you go to chapter 3, and then the serpent enters, right? Now, the serpent is not the devil.
No.
It has nothing to do with the devil. This is really bad theology. It's also bad history.
Yeah.
There was no devil around when these texts were written.
No.
The idea of Satan came like 500 years later in the intertestamental time and so on. So what the serpent stands for is actually the growing awareness of our finitude. So what the serpent then says, the serpent distorts what God said. And this is all symbolic, so don't think of this as like, concretely, obviously, but it's basically a story to make a point, right? And so the serpent says, did God really say that you should not eat from any of the trees in the garden? So what do we have here? We have the scarcity principle.
Yeah.
That's the scarcity principle. First we had, okay, this one tree don't eat from, and now all of a sudden this one tree has become everything.
Yeah.
It's like everything you shouldn't eat from.
And you are no longer aware of all the other trees or all the other things that provide life around you.
Yeah. The whole abundance has been sucked into this one moment of thou shalt not. And so now God, the serpent, portrays God as an ultimate depriver. And what does the character of the woman, Eve, do there? She does something that often Christian theology has not credited her for. She defends God.
Yeah.
She says, no, that's not what God said. Mm-hmm. God said we can eat from all the trees in the garden. But then she adds something. She adds a taboo. And she said, and that we should not touch it. Yeah. Well, that God didn't say that either. So what has happened now is, as a result of this fear that they shouldn't eat from all the trees of the garden, that there would be scarcity. As a result of that fear, the character of Eve adds a taboo. Now, what that tells us psychologically, like if you say, okay, I shouldn't touch this, then basically, I maybe want to touch, but I'm afraid of touching it, right? So fear has entered into her in a particular way. And so in my book, I present the analysis of this story by Eugen Drewermann, spelled like Eugene without an E at the end, and then Drewermann, like Drew, and then E-R-M-A-N-N. And what he points out is that basically when that happens, all of a sudden, God, the life-giving God, is lost in a fantasy of fear. And in fact gets infected with fear, becomes the source of fear now. Because the serpent basically portrays it as if now they should be afraid of God, right? And so Now, what does this mean? That means in the story that they don't have this feeling anymore of everything is great, everything is rich, there's enough to go around for everyone. Instead, now they're afraid there's not enough to go around for everyone. And most of all, they feel, and this is emphasized in the story, they feel this desire to ground themselves again. They feel lost, they feel like uprooted. They don't have a ground of being, as we say in some of theology, right? With Paul Tillich or so. They lost that. And now what they try to do is they desperately try to gain that by taking the fruit.
Yeah.
So the fruit only becomes so attractive, it says it there, at that point the fruit becomes attractive, namely to use that fruit as a defense mechanism, basically. As something that makes them feel, okay, if we take that, then we're going to soothe ourselves, then we're going to be nourished again. But what the serpent had said, if you take from that fruit, then you will be like God. And now this is where racism comes in. When there is a fear of annihilation, when there's a fear of death, a fear of nothingness, that we don't matter, then it is easy to take the fruit of prejudice and eat that and farm out the non-mattering to the out-group. That's what happened in Nazi Germany with Hitler getting a whole group of people and acting on the prejudice again of anti-Semitism and annihilating a whole people. Genocides are based on this. And so is racism. But what I'm trying to emphasize here, what's very important to understand is that it comes out of a fear. And so all these policies, institutional racism, it's only kept in place, it's only propped up as long as people have this fear. If people don't have this fear, then basically these structures can dissipate. So we have this fear comes up, then the defense is, I'm playing God. But I'm grabbing the fruit of racism, I'm grabbing the fruit and play God because I'm afraid. Yeah. So it's defensive omnipotence. And there's actually, in some psychologies like psychoanalysis, there are ideas that early on in life we all need to, on some level, feel omnipotent. Yeah. Like, in love, actually, in true love, we have a sense of omnipotence, but it's not a sense of omnipotence that kills another. It's a sense of omnipotence that shares. We're all absolutely valuable, right? It's like that. Fear of nothingness, defensive omnipotence that distorts the self, that distorts God, and then farming out of that fear of non-mattering and say, the other group is not mattering.
Yeah.
And so that's underlying white supremacy.
Yeah.
That's underlying white Christian nationalism. So we project basically the fear, we project this fear of not mattering and farm it out to a whole group and then fight it there. And so the problem with it, of course, is we will then keep treating the other as if they're nothing. And laws are established based on this. Laws, rules, policies are made up of this. There's a correlation here to how we treat poor people. The Poor People's Campaign is bringing a lot of attention to this, right?
A reminder, yeah.
Yeah, a reminder, and there's a similar dynamic here. We don't, like when the 2020 presidential election the campaigns were running, the Poor People's Campaign invited all the presidential candidates. One of the things that Reverend Dr. William Barber asked each of these candidates, will you talk about poverty during the campaign? Will you speak up for the poor? Because in recent history, talking about poverty has almost become like, something that you don't do. You only talk to the middle class, to the working people.
The working people, yeah, because if you're in poverty, that means you don't work, right?
Right, yeah, that's right, exactly. That's the idea.
You're poor on your own accord.
Exactly.
Your own behavior.
Yeah, it's your fault, right? Yeah. There's a moralizing going on, right? But again, we partly do that. We partly look down on poverty because it actually reminds us of our existential poverty. So when Jesus talks about blessed are the poor, he doesn't talk about, oh, let's keep people poor.
Yeah.
That's not what he means. What he's talking about is blessed are those who are comfortable with their finitude.
Yeah.
Blessed are those who are not afraid of being vulnerable.
Yeah.
That's why he says, blessed are those who weep, right?
Yeah.
Being comfortable, not creating fake omnipotence.
Yeah.
Which we do with our military, which we do in racist policies.
Yeah.
Farming out is basically the third step. Now, in the Bible, you have that happening when after the so-called fall story, they experience God now as somebody who actually puts them out of paradise into the land of Nod, right? That's where Cain ends up, which is the land of misery. Yeah. That's what that means. And so basically what happens at that point, when God is lost in a fantasy of fear, in a fantasy of, I'm not mattering, so I have to now create my own mattering through taking the fruit, through taking something finite, right? I'm taking something finite. And slavery was one of those things. It was farming out the not mattering to some people. It was also the slave owners playing God, basically.
Yeah.
The slave owners trying to create something out of nothing, which is supposed to be one of the characteristics of God in classical theology. Mm-hmm. Because you basically treat somebody like nothing, and then you exploit them to create something without giving them really what they deserve, right? Yeah. Right? So you have an inflation of what you get, and you have a deflation of what they deserve. And we do that still with poverty wages.
Yeah.
With not giving a living wage.
Yeah.
It's unconscionable that we have policies in place where people cannot have a living wage.
Yeah.
Those policies are all predicated on, I'm afraid that if I give what I feel I need to secure myself, then there's not enough to go around.